Normally, JavaScript errors in workers are uncaught exceptions and will display in Chrome's JavaScript console if you have it open. It's possible to add your own handler for these errors, and here's how to do it. I have here open in my text editor, worker errors-working.html. This is a working copy of worker com-done.html from the chapter 2 folder in the exercise files. And this is the copy that's off on my server. Again, you want to use your own server. You don't really want to be doing this on my server. That won't work. Let's just take a look at the file and a page through this for the people that are typing it in. And this one's a little bit longer than some of the other ones have been. And there's a little bit off to the right here as well. So that's our starting place. I also have worker find prime.javascript open over here. And this is the actual worker code that gets loaded up in the worker object. So I want to show you this running in the browser. And just as it is, if I type in a number here, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it'll show me the next prime after that. And if I were to introduce an error in the JavaScript, come over here to the JavaScript file and just type in an extra character there in front of VAR, and I'll save that, pressing Command S on the Mac here, and go back to the browser and hit reload, you notice that it just silently fails. If I type in a number, type in 25, I get the first prime greater than 25 is, and it shows me a blank. It's not really showing me the error. If I bring up the JavaScript console here in Chrome by pressing Option-Command-J on the Mac, there we see in the JavaScript console, we have an uncaught syntax error, unexpected identifier. And so that's the error message that we want to see for this error that we've introduced into the JavaScript. Now the object here is to catch that error and handle it with our own code. And so we're going to do that by coming up here to our working copy of the worker errors.html. And I'm going to add another callback function for the errors themselves. So I'll come up here and I'll say function error callback. And this gets an error object. And I use my display error function, which is defined below. And the error object has a message member, parentheses here, for the file name and the line number. Error file name, colon, and error line number. And then just above that, I'm going to call a method called prevent default on the error object. And this prevents the errors from bubbling up to the other error handlers. If I don't do this, I'll get both my error message and the error message in the JavaScript console. And that's not really what we want. So we say error.prevent default like that. And I'll just put in a comment, prevent default error actions. All right, so that's our error handler, pretty simple. And we plug that in by coming down here into the init function and adding another event listener. So I'm just going to copy and paste because I am fundamentally lazy. Of course, is a virtue in a programmer. And instead of message here, I'm going to say error. And instead of worker callback, I'm going to say error callback. And that's really all there is to it. So I'm going to save this, pressing Command S here on this Mac, and come over to the browser and press reload. Now we have our error message, because you remember the error is still there in the JavaScript. And our error message says uncaught syntax error, unexpected identifier, and it gives the file and the line number. Just like what we got in the Chrome's JavaScript console, but now I don't need to have that open anymore. So I can close that, and I get my error messages right there where I can see them. So if I come back here into the JavaScript and take that extraneous character out and save, Command S, and come back into Chrome and reload. Now our error is gone and our code works just as expected. And there's our result. So handling errors in your worker is pretty straightforward. You just add an error handler in your parent JavaScript file and plug in the appropriate event handler.